And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit of work that we've been doing in the last few years, myself and my colleagues, and in and outside of my lab, looking at the relationship between how we remember the past and how we envision the future. And so here we'll be talking about subjective time, how we think about the future, and I'll be talking about it in a pretty specific way. So just as we can recollect events from our past, specific events that we've experienced, we can envision specific events that we have not yet experienced. And some people have called this pre-experiencing. So how we can sort of go forward in time, even though we know that the event won't unfold exactly as we're thinking about, we can still nonetheless think about what dinner might be like tonight, for example, and have some sort of idea of what we might experience. So the impetus for this work are some observations made by Endel Tolving with respect to time and subjective time. And he introduced the field to this idea of mental time travel. And he made this distinction in 1985. I'll pull out a quote more recently. He said, when one thinks about today, about what one did yesterday, time's arrow is bent into a loop. The rememberer has mentally traveled back into her past and thus violated the law of the irreversibility of the flow of time. She has not accomplished the feat in physical reality, of course, but rather in the reality of the mind. So we know that humans spend a large part of their day thinking about the future, envisioning what they might be about to experience. By one estimate, about every 16 minutes we engage in this sort of thinking. We can ask why we might do it, and we can ask how we might do it. How do we piece together these sort of subjective experiences? So the reason Tolving started thinking about this idea and tying remembering to what he calls episodic future thought is some observations he made from a patient with amnesia. His name was, he goes by Casey in the literature. Kent is his name. And so he suffered a motorcycle crash in 1981. He's in his late 50s now. He has global amnesia. He can't remember a single episode from his past. He can carry on a normal conversation. He can play chess, maybe not too well, but he can play chess. He, in many ways, in the immediate present is just fine. Nonetheless, he cannot remember a single event from his past. And this has been true now since 1981, since his crash. He has pretty profound damage to hippocampus and medial temporal structures and surrounding structures. And the novel observation that Tolving made with respect to Casey is that he has another very interesting deficit, and that he also cannot envision the future in any sort of specific way. He just can't think about the future. Yeah?
Do you mean he can't remember anything before 1982?
He cannot remember anything from his life before the immediate conscious present. So he has retrograde and anterograde amnesia. And so you can see this. Tolving has a few snippets of conversation about this patient. So for example, he says to him, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? And then after a long pause, Casey smiles and he says, I don't know. Do you remember the question about what I'll be doing tomorrow? Yes. How would you describe your state of mind when you try to think about it? And then he says, blank, I guess. And so Casey has a number of very interesting observations about the phenomenological experience that he has when he tries to remember or tries to envision the future. So in other times he says it's like being asleep, or a big blankness sort of thing, or being in a room with nothing there and having a guy tell you to go find a chair and there's nothing there. Another time he says it's like swimming in the middle of a lake. There's nothing there to hold you up or do anything with. And so he understands the question full well. He can describe what he's experiencing. He just can't experience the memory, and he cannot experience what he might be about to do in terms of an event in his own personal future. So here we're not talking about planning. We're talking about thinking about oneself at a time other than the present. So thinking about oneself yesterday or tomorrow. And Tolving's suggestion was that perhaps these two deficits occur hand in hand. So perhaps it's actually not just KC, but in general, if you have global amnesia, can't remember a single event from your life, perhaps people cannot envision the future. This is complemented by a report out of Stan Klein's lab at UCSB, where he also reported a patient who could not envision the future. And this person, he demonstrated has full understanding of time, talks about the future. He talks about clocks. He understands exactly what you're asking him. He can tell you about problems that the world faces in the future. So he can talk at length about global warming and how this is a problem, but he can't think about himself, or he can't sort of see himself in the future. So this is the type of future thought, and this is what Tulving has referred to as episodic future thought. And Tulving further has suggested that we might have a type of consciousness, he's given it a name, autonoetic consciousness, but this is a type of consciousness that underlies this perhaps human ability. He argues that it's uniquely human, but I'll put that aside. But a human ability to remember and to envision the future are underlain by sort of a single core cognitive capacity. Now, as I mentioned, this sort of lay dormant in the literature for a while until a few years ago when my colleagues and I, and separately Dan Schachter's lab, got very interested in this possibility and in using sort of new techniques in order to try to study this question. So just one more quote here. When Casey is asked to describe what it's like, to compare what it's like when he tries to remember and think about the future, he says it's the same kind of blankness. So what we decided to do is to use fMRI techniques, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look at healthy young adults. So now we're not studying patients, but just healthy young adults, typically college students. And we're asking them to basically to remember and to envision specific episodes that could unfold in their future. And we're asking them to do this in the context of our experiment. We adopted a well-used technique in the autobiographical memory literature, so people who study basically memory for life events. And this technique basically has people given a cue, getting lost, for example, and they're asked to think of a single specific instance in their life, a single specific memory, and to build it up as much as they can, remember as much as they can, and to spend 10 seconds doing so. It takes a little while to do this. It takes people about 5 to 7 seconds before they feel like they're really getting a hold of a memory. So we asked them to do this for 10 seconds. We didn't ask them to say anything or push any buttons, but just think of a memory. If you've never gotten lost before, fine. Just use it as a starting point and come up with a single memory from your life. And we asked people to do this. We also asked them to envision a specific event that could unfold in their future. So in the example here, a library, just use that as a cue to come up with some sort of event that might happen in your future, and again, spend 10 seconds building up this single event and get it to be as vivid as you can. So we can look here at the similarities between the two, or sorry, we can look at the differences between the two in this way, but if we want to take seriously the idea that there might be a capacity that underlies this ability to think about ourselves in time, we needed another condition to compare these two. So to do that, we had people imagine another person performing an event or taking place in an event, but not in any specific time, just imagine this event unfolding. So the person we chose, because our subjects, after we tried a number of different people, told us that this worked the best for them, was to use former US President Bill Clinton to basically, for a number of different cues, think about an event. Just in your mind, come up with an event that seems as vivid as you can, and do this for 10 seconds. So now again, we can compare remembering and future against each other and against this other condition in which people are imagining another person, not in a specific time, but imagining another person in a very vivid way taking place in some sort of event. So there are a lot of ways to look at these data, and this is actually not the one we reported, but I think it's a sort of a very straightforward way to think about it. And so what I'm going to do here is show you. This is a meta-analysis of the autobiographical memory literature. So these are the regions that most reliably people report in the imaging literature. And if you just take my word for it, that these are the regions that, at least according to the literature, are active when we try to remember events from our past, we can ask, how do these three conditions behave in these regions? So basically, how do memory regions activate in these three different conditions? So if we think back to KC, who could do neither remembering or envisioning the future, we might expect to see some pretty strong similarities. On the other hand, subjectively, they feel quite different. So we know typically when we're remembering and when we're thinking about the future, we don't often confuse the two. So how does this network of regions behave? First, I'm going to show you basically the time course of activation, activity as it unfolds over time for all these regions combined. So you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but basically we've got bilateral hippocampus, we have medial frontal cortex, posterior cingulate, thalamus, among others. And so averaging across all of these, what we see is that when we remember and we envision the future, activity is identical and greater than if we're thinking about another person, irrespective of time. So pretty convincingly, identical activation if you average across, collapse across all these various regions. So we can now look, if we break down the separate regions and ask the same sort of thing. So how does the bold activity differ among these three conditions across the various regions and parse them apart? We see the same basic finding. So that the red and blue are right on top of each other, red being the activity as we remember, blue as we're envisioning ourselves in the future, and then green as we're thinking about another person. So this was actually really quite surprising to us. It took us a while to wrap our heads around it. At the same time we were wrestling with this, Dan Schachter's lab also had very, very similar findings. And so we began to really try to figure out what was going on. And is it the case, could it really be the case that this is some sort of marker for what Tolving talks about as autonoetic consciousness? Could it really be that when we think about ourselves in time, there's sort of something special underlying this set of processes? And specifically what I want to look at or talk about now is there anything special about time? So in the two conditions that activate more, we're thinking about ourselves at a time other than the present. Is time really important for driving these differences in activity levels? And although we really kind of wanted to think that way, when we thought about it and looked at what our subjects were telling us, it seemed to us that maybe that might not be the case. So we asked people after they got out of the magnet just to write down what they had thought about as they had gone through these three different tasks. So I'll just give you sort of a few examples and show you where our thinking was leading, and then how we went about trying to test this. So this is a person's recollection of what they had thought about when they had been in the magnet, thinking about their birthday. So it's my 13th birthday, May 20th. My 20 best friends and I are at a swimming pool located by my high school. My mom baked 2 heart-shaped cakes because my birthday is close to Valentine's Day. Some of my friends got up on the pool deck and made a dance routine to Backstreet Boys. Some of us played water basketball. Everyone still wore one-piece bathing suits. Okay, so this is pretty specific. It's specific in time and place. There's specific people involved. And we can contrast this to what a person would say when they would write about thinking about their future. And so an example of this, this person was asked to think about New Year's Eve. I'm at a party with my boyfriend and other friends. We're watching the ball drop. Everyone has a glass of champagne and waiting to toast. In the living room of my parents' house, dark in the room, people wearing party hats, lots of snacks on the table. So again, pretty specific in terms of the people there, the places, etc. And then if we look at what they say in the third condition, it's more semanticized, it's more general. So for Clinton, for birthday, this person says, I imagine him in the Oval Office and his cabinet and advisors and other people that work with him bringing a cake to him. And Hillary comes in, he's just sitting at his desk, they sing to him, he gets a little embarrassed, stands up and blows out the candle. Then they socialize a little, and slowly people leave, okay? So this is more, we thought, as we looked at a number of these, not just these three, but as a number of these, it seemed to us that they were sort of less specific in terms of sort of spatial arrangement when they were talking about another person, at least this particular other person. So to try to tease apart, is there something special about time, or is it maybe more the spatial placement? We did a very, very similar experiment to the one that I showed you before, but now we had three conditions in which people were thinking about themselves at a time other than the present. Two of those conditions involved thinking about the future. One of them involved thinking about or remembering a past event. Okay, so the first condition, we asked people to remember, but we asked them to place this memory. Be sure to place your memory in a specifically familiar context. So this is what people tend to do anyway. If you're remembering something, you're putting it in a place that you're familiar with for the most part. You've been there, and that's why you're remembering it. But we went ahead and told them specifically, put it in a place that's familiar to you. In the second condition, we had them envision a future event in a place that was familiar to you. So library, or if the library is not familiar to you, use it as some sort of spark to think about a specific place that's familiar to you and set a specific event that could unfold in your life. Again, these are healthy young adults, and we asked them to do each of these tasks for 10 seconds. Third condition, ask them to envision a specific future episode that could occur within an unfamiliar context. So now we give them a different set of cues, like for example, bullfight, and we're asking them to think about themselves in a potential episode that could involve in their personal future in an unfamiliar place. And so again, all three involve thinking about the time other than the present, and the question is whether the specific setting drives activity within this network of regions. And the answer is yes. It's actually, there's something that seems to be important about the physical setting in which we place these things. So again, in all cases, we're thinking about it ourselves at a time other than the present, and that does not seem to be the key that differentiates these conditions. We can compare, again, the separate regions. So these are the data I showed you earlier. And below them, I'm going to show you the three new conditions. Again, when we think about ourselves in a familiar location, there's a lot of activity, and less activity when we're thinking about ourselves in the future in an unfamiliar location. So in terms of sort of subjective time and thinking about ourselves in the past or future, it doesn't necessarily seem to be time that's differentiating these three in terms of neural activity, but more the placement of these events. Okay, so just really quickly, one other point that we've made is that if episodic future thought really draws heavily from memory, then the phenomenological qualities of episodic future thought should vary as a function of the memories upon which they're based. And I won't go through the details here too much, other than to say that that's actually what we observe. When we have people rate for us how vivid their future thoughts are when they're set in either familiar settings in orange or in novel settings shown in gray. When they set them in familiar settings, they report to us that they're much more vivid. So then the basic point here is that the places of our lives seem to form the building blocks of remembering an episodic future thought. Now, one final point I want to make to you is that it's not the case that there were no differences in the brain for remembering an episodic future thought. So there were no difference, there were no regions anywhere that were more active for remembering than envisioning the future when we did a whole brain analysis. So when I showed you before, we were just looking at memory regions. We look at the entire brain. We don't see anything more active than for remembering than thinking about the future, which is really, really puzzling to us. At least at first. But what we do find is regions that are more active for thinking about the future than for remembering. And actually, this is pretty interesting because this is something that people have not so much been following up lately. But there are these regions, and it probably, at least our suggestion is that because the future is less certain, there's just sort of more, it's more effortful. People report that it's more effortful. And these regions, at least arguably, might underlie sort of the representation of thinking about our bodies in space. At least that we could try to make that connection. We haven't empirically tested this. But the idea is that sort of we're primed to think about the past. That's easier to put together. We have all the pieces. Whereas when we think about the future, yes, we are drawing from memory, but we're recombining things that we've experienced in novel ways. And in doing that, so there is something that's more constructive about thinking about the future. So the future does seem to be more constructive. One point that I'll let Roddy make is that, to be clear though, that it's not the case that memory is not constructive. Memory is very constructive. Actually, when we recollect, we are also sort of building upon what we remember and filling in gaps. But certainly thinking about the future involves more of those types of processes. So as Loftus said, memories don't just fade, they also grow. Every time we recall an event, we must reconstruct the memory. And with each recollection, the memory may be changed, colored by succeeding events, other people's recollections or suggestions, increased understanding, or a new context. So I will skip over this last part and say actually that there's nice evidence that there's good functional importance for thinking about the future. So this is just a study looking at college students' grades and how basically if they were instructed to think about the future in different ways, it influenced actually the amount of studying they did, the number of days they studied, and the grades on their final exams. So there's a reason that we do this thinking. So then the fundamental conclusions here, when we envision potential scenarios in the future, we draw upon the brain regions that are used to remember life events. So we draw upon memory of the places of our lives to build potential future scenarios. And then I didn't really build up this point, but again, Roddy will be doing it next, that just as we build future thoughts, we also build memories in the sense that they're reconstructive. And final slide is to thank my collaborators who did a lot of this work. Thanks.